Canada, the Great White North, home of good hockey, maple syrup, the Mounties, and some of our closest friends. It's understandably been home to a lot of really good college football players too. Think Chase Claypool from Abbotsford, British Columbia, N'Keal Harry from Toronto, or Chuba Hubbard from Edmonton, Alberta. It's also home to its own version of professional football, as well as its own version of NCAA football, known as U Sports. U Sports football is made up of 27 teams in 4 conferences. They play for the Vanier Cup and the National Championship, and it's been most won by the Laval Rouge et Or. There are some minor differences between American and Canadian football that are upheld in these leagues, like the sizes of the fields, how many downs it takes to get a first down, and the goalpost being in front of the end zone instead of being at the back like they used to be in American football. Historically, there have been some times that Americans and Canadians played football against each other. There was the Tea and Coffee Bowls held in London during World War II and played between military personnel. There have also been a few games played between the CFL and NFL, like in 1961 when the St. Louis Cardinals beat the Toronto Argonauts 36-7, the Chicago Bears beat the Montreal Alouettes 34-16, and the Hamilton Tiger Cats beat the Buffalo Bills 38-21. But throughout the history of collegiate football, there haven't really been all that many instances of Canadian colleges playing American ones. Early on in the beginnings of football, there were a few instances. Harvard specifically played a bunch of games against Canadian colleges in the 1870s, and Michigan State Normal College had a series with the Ontario school Assumption in the 1900s. North Dakota State even took on the Winnipeg Blue Bombers of the CFL in 1945. But since 1954, when Eastern New Mexico took on Notre Dame of Canada, no official game between a Canadian school and an American school had taken place. That is, until Simon Fraser entered the scene. The story of Simon Fraser starts in 1965 with the creation of the athletic department. They wanted to choose a nickname to honor the Scottish heritage of the university's namesake, the Scottish-Canadian fur trader Simon Fraser, and the name they chose was the Clan. Remember, this is Canada in the 60s, so right from the beginning, you have the Simon Fraser Clan. The Clan were interested in having just about every major sport right from the get-go at SFU. Big Canadian sports like basketball, soccer, and hockey were no-brainers. But one underrated sport that got a lot of traction in British Columbia was football. By the 60s, British Columbia's culture more closely resembled that of Washington and Oregon than it did the more centralized regions of Canada, like Saskatoon or Manitoba. To make it more apparent, the CFL's BC Lions had been created just over 10 years ago, but won their first Grey Cup in 1964. American football, or at least a Canadian version of American football, had never been more popular in British Columbia. So the Clan decided that right from the jump, they would sponsor football as a sport. But weirdly enough, they didn't want to sponsor Canadian football. They wanted American football. The traditional college conference for Canadian teams, U Sports, didn't sponsor the American version of football. Simon Fraser wanted to play American football against American teams, right from the jump. So they joined the one division that would let them, the National Association of Intercollegiate Athletics, otherwise known as the NAIA. Their first season, unsurprisingly, was a bit of a mess. They couldn't join a conference, so they remained an independent, miles away from their closest American counterparts in the NAIA. They also didn't have a specialized stadium for themselves, so they played home games in 2 venues: Queen's Park Arena, an indoor hockey and lacrosse stadium in New Westminster, and Empire Stadium in Vancouver, the home of the BC Lions. They'd finished the year at 2-3, with one of the most odd schedules I've personally ever seen in my time researching college football teams. They started the year off against the Vancouver Cats, which are not a college football team, but were instead a semi-pro team playing in the North Pacific Football League, which was a hybrid league between teams on the American and Canadian sides of the Pacific Northwest border. The Cats, though, were so bad in 1965 that they went 0-9 and disbanded before the season was over, going so far as to switch the sport they played entirely to rugby. Imagine a football team being so bad in today's day and age that they just decide to change sports to soccer or basketball. They followed that game up with a loss to Western Washington State. That would be Western Washington State's junior varsity squad, that is. You remember in high school when you had JV and freshman teams? This was back when college teams still had separations for their varsity and junior varsity squads. They traveled to Seattle to take on the Washington Huskies, again, just their freshmen, and lost before playing another North Pacific Football League team in the Bellingham Bell Jets before returning to Vancouver just in time to lose to Oregon State's freshman team. That means that the 2 teams that Simon Fraser beat in 1965 were semi-pro league teams, and the 3 teams they lost to weren't just low-level college teams, they were literally B or C teams. That is, in my experience, One of the weirdest seasons I've ever seen in college sports history. Information on other seasons is hard to come by, but there are a few that stand out, like for instance the 1970 season. After just existing for 5 years, they had built themselves up enough to be a threat in the NAIA. Part of this included a ragtag group of players, like quarterback Dave Syme, who had originally quit the team in 1968, and an unknown freshman that stepped onto the scene in Terry Bailey. The season started with 2 exhibition matches against the Seattle Cavaliers and BC Rebels. Both these teams were, again, semi-pro teams. The season officially started a week afterward with a victory over Portland State at home. Head coach Lauren Davies continued to help pilot the option offense to more victories, including over Whitman and Whitworth to nearly identical wins. The talk of the Pacific Northwest immediately shifted over the border to Canada. As Coach Davies proclaimed, Canadians are as good as Americans in college football. Their first road trip to a growing rival in Western Washington ended in a 7-0 victory, followed by a 21-16 win over Oregon College. What followed next was the Shrum Bowl. The Shrum Bowl was one of the most unique events in college football. Starting in 1967, the 2 premier college football powers of British Columbia, that being the University of British Columbia and Simon Fraser, began a football series against each other. The early difficulties are the obvious ones. UBC played Canadian football as a member of what would later become U Sports. SFU played American football. Those are 2 different versions of the game, with more than enough small quirks between the 2 of them. What made both universities primed for a rivalry is the fact that they were crosstown rivals, just 26 kilometers away from each other. That's just 3 miles further than USC is to UCLA. The first game took place in 1967, under American rules. Since SFU was used to American rules, they dominated early, leading UBC to boycott the game until 1978, when the 2 teams agreed to alternate the rules they were playing with every so often. In 35 total games from 1967 to 2023, the game was nearly even, split at 17-16-1 in favor of Simon Fraser, making it one of the most balanced rivalry games in college football, and it was played entirely north of the border. The 1970 game, however, wasn't as balanced. SFU blew out the Thunderbirds 61-6. It would be the largest blowout in the history of the game. SFU finished with 2 more games, wins against Oregon Tech and Puget Sound, to finish the year at 8-0, ranked 6th in the NAIA polls and 2nd in the Northwest polls. Over the years, Simon Fraser remained an oddity in American college football. In a sea of American flags, there was one red maple leaf. That is, at least until 2001. For 36 years, the Klan were members of the NAIA, but in 2001, there were more than enough problems caused by that alignment. Simon Fraser Athletics as a whole had struggled to stay relevant in the NAIA, especially after some of its rival institutions left the NAIA for NCAA Division II as early as 1997. According to Simon Fraser Athletics, they'd applied for a waiver to join Division II, but were denied. Isolated and with nowhere else to go, Simon Fraser ended its American experiment and joined Canadian Inter-University Sport, later known as U Sports, in 2001. Simon Fraser didn't exactly barnstorm the Great White North upon entering the Canada West Universities Athletics Association in 2002, which is the Canadian equivalent of a college conference. Their best stretch came in year 2 in 2003, where they made the playoffs and beat the University of Alberta to win the Hardy Cup, essentially a conference title, and then got blown out by St. Mary's in the UTEC Bowl, essentially the Canadian National Semifinal. They wouldn't make the playoffs again until 2008, where they managed to beat Saskatchewan, but lost to the Calgary Dinos for the Hardy Cup. Other than those 2 seasons, though, Simon Fraser was downright terrible. They finished their time in the CIS with a dismal record of 16-47-2. If you ignore the 2 seasons they made the postseason, their record is an awful 6-41-2, or a win percentage of just under 13%. The Klan were bad. But their sojourn in Canada wasn't for long. In 2010, the university announced that Simon Fraser would be joining the NCAA after all. They would become the first non-American member of the NCAA by joining the Division II Great Northwest Athletic Conference. This is a first for a Canadian university, said Simon Fraser president Michael Stevenson. It reflects SFU's long history of competing in U.S. varsity associations and conferences. Unfortunately, while joining NCAA Division II made them one of the most unique schools in college sports, it didn't bring them any more success. Their best season, 2012, ended in a 5-6 regular season record and no trip to the postseason. They failed to win a regular season game from 2015 to 2017, going 0-29 during that 3-year span. Their performances wouldn't improve under new head coaches like Thomas Ford or Mike Rigel. The fact of the matter was, it was so difficult to recruit Canadians to play American football against American teams instead of their compatriots in the Canadian version of the sport. They were even led by CFL coaches like Jacques Chapdelaine in 2014 and Kelly Bates from 2015 to 2017. Nothing worked. The team underwent a name change in 2020. Clan wasn't sitting right with audiences in 2020, even Canadian audiences, given recent events in North America. So as the only Canadian team in the NCAA, the university chose a new, more patriotic nickname, the Red Leafs. Their world started to collapse around them even further in 2022. The Great Northwest Athletics Conference, where Simon Fraser played, was rapidly losing football members. Both Dixie State and South Dakota School of Mines left the conference in 2016. Humboldt State left in 2019, followed by Azusa Pacific in 2020, leaving the conference with just Simon Fraser, Central Washington, and Western Oregon. With just 3 members, the conference wasn't very stable, so the football wing dissolved, and those 3 schools moved their football teams to a very unorthodox conference in 2022, the Lone Star Conference. As you can guess, the Lone Star Conference was based in Texas, with other schools in New Mexico. So now you had schools in Oregon, Washington, and freaking Canada in a conference based in Texas, with Simon Fraser being the furthest flung member of the conference. That proved to be the death knell for the Clan. In 2022, the Lone Star Conference, tired of making consistent trips away from the American Southwest and north of the border, decided not to renew Simon Fraser's lease with the conference. They essentially kicked them out. With nowhere else to go, according to SFU President Joy Johnson, they made the decision to shutter the football program. Their existing football players would be allowed to transfer to different programs, with many of them switching to U Sports programs instead of American ones. A football team that had been the largest in all of Division II, and also, potentially, the most unique trailblazer in NCAA history, finally breathed its last in 2022. They went 1-9 in their final year and finished their time as a D2 school at 18-99. From 1865 to 2022, the Red Leafs compiled a record of 186, 321, and 2. They won only 1 conference title in their existence in 2003 and went 0-1 in bowl games. On the surface, this isn't a team that anybody would miss. They weren't very competitive, and they didn't send all that many players to the NFL or CFL. Their most prominent player was Nathan Shepard, and even he left SFU after just a few years and ended up getting drafted out of Fort Hays State. But even still, Simon Fraser is anything but a footnote. So far, they remain the only international school in history to dare to play against American colleges, in both the NAIA and NCAA's Division II. They switched back and forth between American and Canadian leagues, and still managed to become the biggest school in Division II. Their crosstown rivalry survived the international dispute, and SFU even managed to play host to the first woman to score in a man's sport in Canada when Christy Elliott did so in 2021. Even today, Canadian schools are tossed out there as potential candidates for conference realignment, with UBC being mentioned for the Mountain West and Toronto being considered for the MAC, to varying levels of seriousness. But had it not been for Simon Fraser, those schools would have been seen as even more of a long shot. At a time where, more than ever, Americans are seeing Canadians as adversaries for whatever dumb reasons, it's important to remember Simon Fraser.